The cameras flashed like lightning across the packed auditorium. 5,000 tech leaders, investors and journalists held their breath as Richard Hale stood frozen at the podium, his hands trembling around a small, crumpled photograph. The man who had commanded boardrooms for 2 decades, who had built a $50 billion empire from lines of code, looked utterly broken. His voice cracked through the microphone. I thought I was here to present our new AI platform, but instead I need to show you something else. The massive screen behind him flickered, displaying not the sleek product demo everyone expected, but the image of a handmade card. Crooked letters spelled out "Happy Birthday, Daddy" in crayon, and beneath it, a faded photograph of a man and a young boy embracing in a park. "This is from my son Noah," Richard whispered, his words echoing across the silent arena. "He has Down syndrome, and 3 weeks ago, I threw his gift in the trash." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Cell phones emerged like a sea of glowing rectangles. Richard's billion-dollar reputation was crumbling in real time, broadcast to millions across the globe. "I need to find him," he said, stepping away from the podium. "I need to tell him I'm sorry." The screen went black. Security rushed the stage. And in that moment, the tech world's golden boy became its most controversial figure, all because of a 12-year-old child he had spent years pretending didn't exist. But how had it come to this? How had one of America's most brilliant entrepreneurs fallen so far from grace? The answer lay in the 3 weeks that had led to this moment. 3 weeks that would change everything. 3 weeks earlier, the alarm chimed at 5:30 a.m. sharp, just as it had every morning for the past 8 years. Richard Hale's penthouse suite in Beverly Hills stirred to life with automated precision, blackout curtains retracting to reveal the sprawling Los Angeles skyline, coffee brewing in the kitchen, and his personal assistant's voice filtering through hidden speakers with the day's schedule. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. You have 7 meetings today, beginning with the board presentation at 8. The driver will arrive at 7:15. Your dry cleaning has been delivered, and the florist confirmed the arrangements for tonight's gala." Richard moved through his morning routine like clockwork. 48 years old, impeccably groomed, with the kind of focused intensity that had made him a Silicon Valley legend. Every gesture was calculated, every minute accounted for. He had built Nexus Technologies from a cramped garage into a global powerhouse that controlled the infrastructure behind half the world's mobile apps. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had revolutionized human connection lived in complete isolation. He dressed in his signature navy suit, Armani perfectly tailored, and checked his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The man staring back looked like success incarnate. Sharp jawline, silver threading through his dark hair, eyes that radiated confidence and calculation. Forbes had called him the architect of digital intimacy. Time magazine had featured him on their cover with the headline, "The Man Who Connected the World." But Richard Hale was more disconnected than ever. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him pause. Light, uneven steps that he recognized immediately. Noah was awake, unusual for this early in the morning. Richard quickly grabbed his briefcase and headed for the private elevator, hoping to avoid the encounter entirely. He almost made it. "Daddy," the voice was soft, hopeful, carrying that particular innocence that both moved and frustrated him in equal measure. "You're leaving already?" Richard stopped but didn't turn around. Noah stood in the hallway wearing Star Wars pajamas, his dark hair tousled from sleep, brown eyes wide with the pure affection that Richard found so difficult to face. "I have meetings, Noah. Maria will give you breakfast." His words were clipped professional, as if he were dismissing an employee rather than speaking to his only child. "But it's Saturday," Noah said, his voice growing smaller. "Remember, you said maybe we could work on the robot today." The robot. Richard had forgotten completely. 3 months ago, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps guilt, he had promised to help Noah build a programmable robot for his school's science fair. The kit still sat unopened in Noah's room, gathering dust like so many other broken promises. "We'll do it another time," Richard said, pressing the elevator button. "I have important work to do." He stepped into the elevator without looking back, missing the way Noah's face fell, missing the quiet, "Okay, Daddy," that followed him down 47 floors to the garage. This was their relationship distilled to its essence. Distance maintained, emotions avoided, love offered only in the form of hired caregivers and expensive toys that Noah rarely played with. Richard told himself it was better this way, cleaner, more efficient. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah Hale had been the heart of their family, the bridge between Richard's brilliant but emotionally guarded world and Noah's boundless, uncomplicated love. When she died in a car accident 4 years earlier, that bridge had collapsed entirely. Richard had thrown himself into work with even greater intensity, building walls around his grief so high that they blocked out everyone, including the son who needed him most. Noah looked exactly like Sarah. The same gentle brown eyes, the same quick smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Every time Richard saw him, the resemblance hit like a physical blow, so he simply stopped looking. The drive to Nexus headquarters took 23 minutes through morning traffic. Richard spent the time reviewing quarterly projections and answering emails, his mind already shifting into the ruthless efficiency that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in American history. By the time he walked into the gleaming glass tower that bore his company's name, Noah was already forgotten, pushed aside like everything else that didn't contribute to the bottom line. The executive floor buzzed with its usual energy. Department heads hurried past with tablets and coffee cups, their conversations filled with terms like user engagement and market penetration. This was Richard's element, a world where problems had solutions and success was measured in clean, quantifiable metrics. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." Jennifer Walsh, his executive assistant, fell into step beside him as he strode toward the boardroom. She was 32, Harvard MBA, sharp as a razor and twice as cutting when needed. "The board is already assembled. Johnson from the Times wants a statement about the European expansion, and your publicist called about the interview, with 60 minutes. Move Johnson to next week, confirm the 60 minutes appearance, but I want to review the questions first." Richard paused outside the boardroom doors, straightening his tie. "And remind everyone that we're announcing the Prometheus launch today. I want this presentation to be flawless." Prometheus was Richard's masterpiece, an AI platform that could predict and fulfill user needs before they even realized they had them. It represented 3 years of development and $800 million in investment. More than that, it represented Richard's vision of a perfectly efficient world where human uncertainty was eliminated through algorithmic precision. The irony, of course, was that Richard himself was living proof of how imperfect and uncertain human nature really was. He pushed through the doors into the boardroom, where 12 of the most powerful people in tech were waiting. The conversation stopped immediately, all attention focusing on the man who controlled their fortunes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice commanding the room with practiced authority, "today we change everything." But as he launched into his presentation, describing algorithms and market projections with clinical precision, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a question he couldn't quite silence. "When was the last time you changed anything that actually mattered?" The thought vanished as quickly as it came, buried beneath layers of ambition and carefully constructed emotional armor. Richard Hale had no time for such philosophical distractions. He had an empire to run, shareholders to satisfy, and a legacy to build. What he didn't realize was that sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest gestures, like a 12-year-old boy wrapping a gift with shaking hands, hoping that maybe, just maybe, his father would finally see him, 2 weeks before the conference. The Nexus Technologies birthday celebration was everything Richard had designed it to be, a perfectly orchestrated display of corporate power disguised as personal celebration. The executive dining room on the 40th floor had been transformed into something resembling a high-end restaurant, complete with white tablecloths, crystal stemware, and a view of downtown Los Angeles that cost more per square foot than most people's homes. 43 of the company's top performers sat around the mahogany table, each having paid careful attention to the unspoken dress code and social hierarchy that governed these events. They laughed at Richard's dry jokes, nodded approvingly at his vision statements, and presented gifts that had clearly been selected by their assistants from a list of acceptable luxury items. "From the entire West Coast development team," announced Marcus Chen, Nexus's chief technology officer, as he handed Richard a slim box containing what appeared to be a vintage Rolex. "We know how much you appreciate precision." The gift received the appropriate murmur of appreciation. Richard examined it with the practiced eye of someone who owned 17 other watches of similar quality, made the required complimentary remarks, and set it aside to be forgotten among the other tokens of corporate loyalty. This pattern repeated for nearly an hour. Designer cufflinks from the marketing department, a first-edition copy of The Innovator's Dilemma from the strategy team, a bottle of 25-year-old scotch from the board of directors, Each gift was more expensive than the last, each presentation more elaborate, each display of wealth more obvious. Richard accepted them all with the same distant gratitude, his mind already moving ahead to the quarterly review meeting scheduled for that afternoon. He had perfected the art of being present without actually being there, a skill that served him well in both boardrooms and family dinners. "This has been wonderful," he said finally, rising from his chair with the subtle authority that ended meetings without discussion. "Thank you all for—" The dining room door opened quietly, and Maria Gonzalez stepped inside, her usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. She had been Noah's primary caregiver for 3 years, a warm, patient woman in her 50s, who treated the boy with the kind of genuine affection that Richard found both admirable and incomprehensible. Behind her, clutching a small wrapped package, stood Noah. The room fell silent with the particular awkwardness that settles over corporate gatherings when personal life intrudes unexpectedly. Noah looked tiny in his khaki pants and button-down shirt, clothes that Maria had clearly helped him select for the occasion. His hair was combed neatly to one side, and he wore the nervous, hopeful expression of a child, trying very hard to do something right. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Maria said quietly, her Spanish accent more pronounced when she was nervous. "He wanted to give you his present. I tried to explain that you were in a meeting, but—" "It's okay," Noah said, stepping forward with the careful determination of someone who had been practicing this moment. "I made it myself." Richard felt the familiar surge of irritation that came whenever his two worlds collided. This was exactly the kind of inefficient, emotionally messy situation he had spent years learning to avoid. 43 of his most senior employees were watching, their expensive gifts suddenly seeming insignificant next to whatever homemade creation Noah had brought. The package itself was modest almost to the point of embarrassment. Brown paper grocery bag repurposed as wrapping paper, secured with blue ribbon that had clearly been tied and retied multiple times. Noah's careful handwriting spelled out "To Daddy" in uneven letters across the top. "That's very thoughtful, Noah," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of polite dismissal he used with persistent reporters. "Why don't you leave it with Maria, and I'll look at it later?" "But I want to give it to you now," Noah insisted, holding out the package with both hands. His voice carried that particular quality that children have when they're trying to be grown up about something important. "It's for your birthday." The silence in the room had grown thick and uncomfortable. Some of Richard's executives were studying their phones with sudden fascination. Others were having whispered conversations that weren't quite quiet enough to hide their content. Richard caught fragments. "Didn't know he had a son. Special needs, right?" Probably should have mentioned heat crept up the back of Richard's neck. This was exactly what he had spent years trying to prevent, his personal challenges becoming public entertainment for his professional circle. Noah's presence wasn't just an interruption, it was a revelation of weakness that could undermine years of carefully constructed authority. "Noah, this isn't the time," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "These people have work to do." "Please?" Noah's brown eyes, so much like Sarah's, filled with the beginning of tears. "I worked really hard on it." Something in Richard's chest tightened, but he pushed the feeling down with practiced efficiency. Sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not in front of the people who controlled millions of dollars in quarterly budgets. "Maria, please take him back to his room," Richard said, turning away from his son's confused expression. "We'll discuss this later." "Richard." Maria's voice carried a note of quiet reproach that made several executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. She had worked for the family long enough to remember when things were different, when Sarah was alive and laughter echoed through the halls of their home. "He's been working on this for weeks. Maybe you could just—" "I said later," Richard interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "I have a company to run." Noah stood frozen for a moment, the wrapped package still extended in his small hands. The room watched in uncomfortable silence as tears finally spilled down his cheeks. He wasn't crying loudly. He had learned through experience that emotional displays only made his father more distant. Instead, he cried the way children do when they're trying to be brave, quietly with dignity that would have been heartbreaking if anyone in the room had been paying attention to anything other than their own discomfort. "Come on, mijo," Maria said softly, placing a protective hand on Noah's shoulder. "Let's go home." As they turned to leave, Noah set the package carefully on the side table by the door, not throwing it down in anger or hurt, but placing it gently, as if it was something precious that might still matter someday. "Happy birthday, Daddy," he whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear. The door closed behind them with barely a sound, but the silence that followed was deafening. 43 of the most successful people in technology sat frozen, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. Some looked genuinely disturbed. Others seemed embarrassed for Richard. A few appeared almost angry at having been made unwilling participants in such a private moment. "Well," Richard said finally, his voice carrying forced lightness that fooled no one. "Shall we get back to business?" But the spell was broken. The celebration, which had felt sophisticated and important just minutes earlier, now seemed hollow and performative. Conversations resumed, but they were stilted and brief. People began checking their phones, remembering urgent meetings, discovering pressing deadlines that required immediate attention. Within 20 minutes, the dining room was empty, except for Richard and the small wrapped package that Noah had left behind. Richard stared at it for a long moment, feeling something uncomfortably close to shame twisting in his stomach. The gift sat there like an accusation, its homemade wrapping paper a stark contrast to the sleek luxury that surrounded it. He could open it now in private, away from the judging eyes of his employees. Instead, he called Jennifer on the intercom. "Have someone clean up in here," he said, "and dispose of anything that was left behind." "Of course, Mr. Hale. Should I save the package by the door? It looks like..." "Everything goes," Richard said firmly. "I don't want any clutter." But as he returned to his office, Richard found that he couldn't quite escape the image of Noah's face when he realized his gift wasn't wanted. The memory followed him through 3 meetings, 2 conference calls, and a working dinner that lasted until nearly midnight. That night, lying alone in his king-sized bed while Noah slept 40 feet away in a room they barely shared as father and son, Richard told himself he had made the right choice. Emotional displays were disruptive to productivity. Personal problems had no place in professional settings. He was protecting both Noah and himself by maintaining appropriate boundaries, but deep in his chest, in a place he had spent years learning to ignore, something small and vital was beginning to crack. And the gift that could have been a bridge between 2 broken hearts was instead buried beneath coffee grounds and corporate waste, thrown away like everything else Richard found too complicated to understand. 10 days before the conference. The morning started like any other in Richard's precisely calibrated world, but technology has a way of making private moments devastatingly public. While he sat in his office reviewing acquisition proposals, 47 floors below him, a custodial worker named Eduardo Martinez was emptying trash bins and trying to support 3 kids on minimum wage. Eduardo had learned to notice things that might have value, not to steal, but because throwing away something important could cost him his job. When he saw the small wrapped package in Mr. Hale's executive dining room wastebasket, something made him pause. The handwriting was clearly a child's, to Daddy in uneven letters, secured with blue ribbon that someone had tied with great care. Eduardo thought of his own 7-year-old daughter, how seriously she took the gift she made for him, how her face would crumple if he ever threw one away without looking. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was paternal instinct, or maybe it was simply the universe's way of ensuring that love, once offered, finds a way to matter. Eduardo opened it. Inside was a single photograph, faded and creased from handling. It showed Richard Hale, younger, laughing, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt instead of his usual corporate armor. He was sitting on a park bench with a small boy in his lap, both of them grinning at the camera with the kind of pure joy that couldn't be manufactured or purchased. Beneath the photo was a piece of cardboard decorated with crayon drawings of rockets and computers and stick figures holding hands. In careful block letters, someone had written, "You still hugged me when I made mistakes with the code. I love you, Daddy. From Noah." Eduardo stared at the message for a long moment, thinking of all the times his own children had needed comfort when their homework was hard, or when they couldn't make their art projects look the way they imagined. The idea of throwing away such a gift seemed not just wasteful, but genuinely wrong. He made a decision that would change everything. Eduardo's niece Carmen worked in the social media department at Nexus, one of those bright, ambitious 20-somethings who understood the power of authentic storytelling in a way that most executives never would. When her uncle showed her the photo and explained where he'd found it, Carmen felt her heart break a little. "This is Noah?" she asked, studying the image of the laughing child in Richard's arms. "I think so," Eduardo said. "The kid who came to the birthday party. The one with..." "You know?" Carmen knew. The story of Noah's awkward appearance at the executive celebration had already made its way through the company's informal communication network. Nothing spread faster through an office building than gossip, especially when it involved the CEO's personal life. "Uncle Eddie," Carmen said slowly, "what if people knew about this? What if they understood that Mr. Hale's son loves him this much and he just threw it away?" She wasn't thinking about viral marketing or corporate scandal. She was thinking about her cousin Miguel, who had autism, and how her family had learned to celebrate his different way of showing love instead of being embarrassed by it. She was thinking about all the kids like Noah, whose parents saw them as problems to be managed rather than children to be treasured. Without thinking through the consequences, Carmen posted the photo on her personal Instagram account with a simple caption, "Sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in brown paper. This was found in a trash bin at my office. The little boy who made it just wanted his daddy to remember when they were happy together. Love is not waste. Every child matters." The post had 37 followers, mostly friends and family members who liked pictures of her coffee and occasional selfies. Carmen expected maybe a few sympathetic heart emojis and some comments from her girlfriends. She got something else entirely. Within 6 hours, the post had been shared 800 times. By the next morning, it had reached 50,000 people. The story of the discarded gift resonated with parents, educators, and advocates for people with disabilities in ways that Carmen had never anticipated. Comments poured in from around the world. "This broke my heart. How can someone throw away their child's love? I have a son with Down syndrome. This gift would be framed in my office. Richard Hale makes billions connecting people through apps, but can't connect with his own child. The hypocrisy is staggering. This man built his fortune on human relationships." By day 3, the story had jumped to Twitter, where Richard Hale gift was trending alongside increasingly harsh commentary about corporate values and parental responsibility. Bloggers picked it up. Parenting websites shared it. Disability rights organizations used it as an example of society's devaluation of children with special needs. Richard himself remained blissfully unaware of the brewing storm. He was in New York for 3 days of back-to-back meetings with investors, staying at his usual suite at the Plaza and maintaining his carefully controlled media blackout during high-level negotiations. Jennifer handled his communications, and she had been instructed years ago to filter out anything that might be considered a distraction. But Jennifer was 28 years old, Harvard-educated, and smart enough to recognize a potential public relations catastrophe when she saw one. When she finally gathered the courage to show Richard the trending story, they were sitting in his hotel suite overlooking Central Park, and he was reviewing talking points for an interview with CNBC. "Richard," she said carefully, "we need to discuss something that's happening online." He glanced up from his notes, annoyed at the interruption. "If it's about the European data privacy concerns, tell legal to handle it. If it's about the Amazon acquisition rumors, refer everyone to our standard statement about not commenting on speculation. It's about Noah." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. He set down his papers and looked at Jennifer with the kind of focused attention she usually only saw during crisis management sessions. "What about Noah?" She handed him her tablet, the screen displaying Carmen's original Instagram post alongside dozens of news articles that had spawned from it. Richard's face went pale as he read the caption, paler still as he recognized the photograph. "This is," he started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "The gift he brought to your birthday celebration," Jennifer said quietly. "Someone found it in the trash and posted it online. It's everywhere, Richard. CNN, Fox News, The Washington Post, everyone's talking about it." Richard scrolled through the comments with growing horror. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and mutating with each retelling until he was being portrayed as a monster who had publicly humiliated his disabled child. The details were often wrong. Some reports claimed he had thrown the gift directly in Noah's face. Others suggested he had made cruel comments about his son's abilities, but the core narrative was devastatingly accurate. He had discarded his child's love like garbage. "How many people have seen this?" he asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. The original post has been shared over 200,000 times. The news stories have reached millions. And Richard, Jennifer's voice carried a note of genuine concern that he rarely heard from her. "It's not just social media. The board is asking questions. Investors are concerned about the impact on our brand image. There are already 3 op-eds questioning whether someone who can't value his own family can be trusted to lead a company that's supposed to bring people together. Richard felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around him. For 20 years, he had maintained absolute control over his public image, revealing only what served his professional interests and keeping everything else locked away behind layers of privacy and corporate protection. Now, the most shameful moment of his personal life was being dissected by strangers on the internet. "We need damage control," he said, his CEO instincts kicking in even as his personal world crumbled. "Issue a statement. Something about private family matters being taken out of context. Maybe mention Noah's education fund or the donations we make to special needs charities." "Richard," Jennifer said gently, "I don't think you understand how bad this looks. People aren't angry about a misunderstanding. They're angry because they believe you don't love your own child." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Richard wanted to deny it, to explain that the situation was more complicated than anyone realized, that he was protecting Noah by maintaining distance. But as he stared at the photograph on the screen, at the genuine joy on both their faces in that long-ago moment, he couldn't find the words. Had he loved Noah then? Had there been a time when his son's differences seemed less important than his presence, when holding him felt natural instead of complicated? Looking at the image, Richard could almost remember. The day was at Griffith Park, just 6 months before Sarah's accident. Noah had been 8 years old, struggling with a simple coding game that Richard had thought might interest him. Instead of getting frustrated when Noah couldn't understand the logic, Richard had set aside his laptop and suggested they go feed the ducks instead. They had spent the afternoon just being together, with no agenda other than enjoying each other's company. Sarah had taken the photo without them noticing, capturing a moment of pure connection that had somehow survived 4 years of grief and avoidance. "The gift," Richard said quietly. "What did it say exactly?" Jennifer read the caption aloud. "You still hugged me when I made mistakes with the code. I love you, Daddy. From Noah." The words hit Richard like a punch to the chest. Noah remembered that day too. Not only remembered it, but treasured it enough to reference it years later in a handmade gift. While Richard had been building walls to keep his grief at bay, Noah had been holding on to the memory of a father who had once accepted his limitations with patience and love. "Mr. Hale," Jennifer's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What do you want me to do?" Richard stared at the photo for a long moment, seeing not just the public relations nightmare it had become, but the private tragedy it represented. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped being the man in that picture, the father who could find joy in his child's presence, rather than disappointment in his differences. "I need to go home," he said finally. "What should I tell the press?" "Nothing. Not yet." Richard stood up, his mind racing through implications and consequences. "Cancel the rest of my meetings. Book the first flight back to Los Angeles. Richard, we need a strategy. If you don't respond soon, this story is going to define you." He was already walking toward the bedroom to pack his bags, but he paused at her words. "Maybe it should," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time people knew who I really am." But as he threw clothes into his suitcase with uncharacteristic carelessness, Richard wasn't entirely sure he knew the answer to that question anymore. The man in the photograph seemed like a stranger, someone who had existed before grief and ambition had calcified around his heart like armor. The question that haunted him as the plane lifted off from JFK wasn't whether he could salvage his public image, but whether he could salvage the relationship that mattered most, and whether Noah would still want to be hugged when his father finally came home. 5 days before the conference, Richard's return to Los Angeles felt like arriving in a foreign country where everyone spoke his language, but none of the words meant what they used to. The paparazzi were waiting at LAX, not the usual business reporters who covered tech acquisitions, but entertainment photographers who specialized in scandal and personal destruction. Their cameras flashed like artillery fire as he walked through the terminal, his security team forming a protective barrier that felt more like a prison. "Mr. Hale, is it true you hate your son?" "Richard, how long have you been ashamed of Noah? Any comment on the calls for your resignation?" He kept his eyes forward, his face locked in the neutral expression that had served him through countless hostile negotiations, but inside each question felt like a blade, finding the spaces between his ribs. By the time he reached the safety of his car, Richard's hands were shaking with barely controlled rage, not at the reporters, but at himself for giving them something genuine to destroy. The mansion in Beverly Hills looked the same from the outside, but everything felt different. Maria met him at the door with an expression he had never seen before, Not the usual polite deference, but something closer to protective fury. "Where is he?" Richard asked without preamble. "In his room. He hasn't come out much since—" She gestured helplessly toward the world outside, where her employer's shame had become international entertainment. "The reporters have been calling. Some even came to the gate. He's scared, Mr. Richard. He doesn't understand why people are angry." Richard felt something twist in his chest. In all his calculations about damage control and public relations, he hadn't considered how the media circus would affect Noah. The boy's world was small and carefully protected. Their home, his special education classes, the few trusted caregivers who formed his support network. The idea of that sanctuary being invaded by strangers with cameras and cruel questions was almost unbearable. "Has he asked about me?" The question slipped out before Richard could stop it. Maria's expression softened slightly. "Every day. He wants to know if you saw his gift, if you liked it." I didn't know what to tell him. The walk to Noah's room felt like the longest journey of Richard's life. The hallway was lined with family photos that had become relics from another era. Sarah laughing at a dinner party, the three of them at Disneyland when Noah was 6, Richard teaching Noah to ride a bike in their driveway, happy moments that felt like evidence of a crime Richard couldn't quite name. He knocked softly on Noah's door and waited for permission to enter. The response was barely audible. "Come in." Noah was sitting at his desk, hunched over a notebook with intense concentration. He was drawing what looked like spaceships, elaborate designs with careful labels written in his distinctive handwriting. He didn't look up when Richard entered, and the silence stretched uncomfortably until Richard cleared his throat. "Hi, Noah." "Hi, Daddy." The words were polite but distant, lacking the usual warmth that had characterized their interactions. "Did you have a good trip?" The question was painfully adult, the kind of safe conversation starter that children learn when they're not sure if they're welcome. Richard realized with a sharp stab of recognition that Noah was protecting himself, building his own walls to guard against further disappointment. "It was fine," Richard said, then immediately regretted the automatic response. When had they started talking to each other like strangers in an elevator? Actually, no, it wasn't fine at all. Noah looked up for the first time, curiosity flickering in his brown eyes. "Why not?" Richard sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware that he couldn't remember the last time he had been in this room for more than a few seconds. It was distinctly Noah's space. Walls covered with drawings and certificates from school, shelves lined with books about space and computers and dragons, a desktop computer that Sarah had given him for his 10th birthday. The room felt lived in and loved in a way that the rest of the house didn't. "Because I made a mistake," Richard said carefully. "A really big mistake." What kind of mistake? The simple question opened a floodgate that Richard hadn't expected. How could he explain that he had spent 4 years running from the memory of his wife's death, that he had confused protecting his son with abandoning him, that he had allowed grief to harden into something that looked dangerously close to shame? "Do you remember the gift you gave me last week, for my birthday?" Noah's face brightened immediately. "Yes. Did you like it? I worked really hard on it. Maria helped me with the ribbon, but I did everything else myself. Richard stopped, realizing that this was the moment of truth. He could lie, claim he had loved the gift, and simply misplaced it. He could offer some sanitized version of events that would spare Noah's feelings while protecting his own guilt. Or he could tell the truth and hope that 12 years of love could survive one moment of stunning failure. "I threw it away," he said quietly. "I didn't even open it. I threw it in the trash." The words hung in the air like a confession at trial. Noah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, something that might have been anger, and finally a kind of resigned sadness that was worse than any tantrum would have been. "Oh," he said simply. "Okay, Noah, it's not okay. It's the worst thing I've ever done." "But you throw away lots of things," Noah said with the devastating logic that children sometimes possess. "You threw away Mum's clothes. You threw away the Christmas decorations. You threw away my finger paintings from art class." Each item on the list felt like another accusation. Richard had indeed disposed of Sarah's belongings with ruthless efficiency, telling himself it was healthy to avoid dwelling on the past. He had eliminated Christmas traditions that reminded him of happier times. He had treated Noah's artistic efforts as clutter rather than treasures. "You're right," Richard said, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "I've been throwing away everything that mattered, including you." "You can't throw me away," Noah said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that broke Richard's heart. "I'm not trash." "No, you're not. You're the most important person in my life, and I forgot that. I got so scared of losing you the way I lost your mother that I pushed you away instead. But I'm not going anywhere, Noah said, his brow furrowed with confusion. I live here. This is my house too. The simplicity of it was devastating. While Richard had been constructing elaborate emotional defenses against future loss, Noah had simply been trying to exist in the present, offering love without conditions or expectations of reciprocity. Can you forgive me? Richard asked and realized he was asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Noah considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. Did you look at the picture? What picture? The one in the gift. The one Mom took at the park when we fed the ducks. Richard's throat tightened. Someone showed it to me. We looked happy. We were happy, Noah said matter-of-factly. You weren't sad all the time then. You laughed at my jokes even when they weren't very good. I want to be that person again, Richard said, surprised by how much he meant it. I want to laugh at your jokes, even the ones about computers, especially those ones. Noah smiled for the first time since Richard had entered the room, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. Okay, but I don't have the picture anymore. It was in the gift. The reminder of what he had destroyed hit Richard with fresh shame. I know, but maybe we could make new pictures, new memories. Like what? Richard looked around the room, his eyes settling on the unopened robot kit that had been gathering dust for months. Like maybe we could finally build that robot you wanted to work on. Really? Noah's entire face transformed with excitement. You mean it this time? I mean it this time. They spent the next 3 hours on the floor of Noah's room, sorting through circuit boards and instruction manuals, with Noah patiently explaining concepts that Richard's brilliant mind couldn't quite grasp in his current emotional state. It was humbling to realize that his son possessed a kind of focused patience that Richard had never developed, the ability to try something repeatedly without frustration, to find joy in the process rather than obsessing over the outcome. Daddy, Noah said, as they connected the robot's power source. Are you famous now? The question caught Richard off guard. What do you mean? Maria showed me the computer. People are writing about us, about the gift. Noah's voice was thoughtful rather than upset. They seem really mad at you. Yes, they are. Because you threw away my present? Because they think it means I don't love you. Noah considered this carefully, his hands still working on the robot's programming interface. But you do love me, right? Even when I'm slow with math, even when I can't tie my shoes the right way? The question pierced through every defense Richard had spent years constructing. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. More than anything in the world. Then the people on the computer are wrong, Noah said with finality. You just forgot for a while. People forget things sometimes. It was such a simple, generous assessment of a complex betrayal that Richard felt tears threatening for the first time in years. How had he raised a child capable of such forgiveness? How had someone so innocent learned to offer grace to a father who had offered so little in return? Noah, he said carefully, would you like to come with me to New York next week? I have to give a speech to a lot of people and I think I need you there. What kind of speech? The kind where I tell the truth. About what? About us. About how sorry I am. About how much you mean to me. Noah's face lit up with an excitement that made Richard's chest ache with regret for all the invitations he had never extended, all the experiences he had withheld in the name of protection. Can I wear my good suit, the one Mom bought me? You can wear whatever makes you happy. And can we sit together on the plane, not in different parts like last time? Richard couldn't even remember the last time he had included Noah on a business trip, much less sat beside him during travel. Another small cruelty born of emotional cowardice. We'll sit together, he promised. And Noah, when we get there, I want to show everyone the robot we built. I want them to see how smart and creative you are, even though it doesn't work perfectly yet, especially because it doesn't work perfectly yet. That's what makes it beautiful. As they worked through the evening, connecting circuits and troubleshooting programming errors with the kind of patient collaboration that Richard had forgotten was possible, he realized that somewhere in the space between throwing away a gift and opening his heart, everything had changed. The man who had walked into this room was the same person who had spent 4 years running from love. The man who would leave was someone else entirely. But the real test wouldn't come in the safety of Noah's bedroom, surrounded by books and drawings, and the unconditional forgiveness of a 12-year-old boy. It would come in front of 5,000 strangers who had already decided what kind of father Richard Hale was. The question that haunted him, as they finally got the robot to take its first halting steps, was whether he could find the courage to prove them wrong. The day of the conference, the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center in Manhattan, had never felt more imposing. Richard stood backstage at the Global Technology Summit, listening to the thunderous applause as the previous speaker concluded his presentation on artificial intelligence ethics. In 4 minutes, he would walk onto that stage and face the largest audience of his career, not to demonstrate a revolutionary product or announce a breakthrough acquisition, but to expose the most vulnerable parts of himself to public scrutiny. Beside him, Noah sat in a chair that had been specially brought in for the occasion, his legs swinging nervously as he adjusted his favorite tie, navy blue with tiny silver rockets. He looked impossibly small in his good suit, but his expression carried the kind of serious determination that Richard had learned to associate with his most important moments. "You don't have to do this," Richard said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Noah or himself. "Yes, I do," Noah replied with the simple certainty that characterized all his decisions. "You said you needed me here." Jennifer appeared at Richard's elbow, her usual efficient demeanor cracked with obvious anxiety. "The board is asking for one final confirmation that you're not planning to deviate from the approved script," she said. "Marcus has the Prometheus presentation ready if you change your mind." The approved script was a masterpiece of corporate damage control, 18 minutes of carefully crafted language that acknowledged a misunderstanding regarding his family while pivoting to Nexus Technologies' commitment to inclusive design and social responsibility. It was safe, professional, and utterly lifeless. It was also a lie. "Daddy," Noah said, looking up from the tablet where he had been reviewing the speech they had worked on together, "are you scared?" The question was so direct and innocent that Richard felt his breath catch. "Yes," he admitted, "I'm terrified. Because people might not like what you say? Because they might not forgive me." Noah considered this with the gravity he brought to all of life's serious questions. "But you're going to tell the truth, right? Even if it's hard. Even if it's hard. Then it doesn't matter if they forgive you right away," Noah said with wisdom that belied his 12 years. "Mom used to say that telling the truth is like planting a seed. Sometimes it takes a while to grow." The mention of Sarah hit Richard with unexpected force. He could almost hear her voice in Noah's words, see her influence in his son's capacity for both honesty and hope. She would have been proud of the man Noah was becoming. The question was whether she would be proud of the father Richard was finally learning to be. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, "please welcome the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies, Richard Hale." The applause was polite but restrained, lacking the enthusiasm that usually greeted tech industry luminaries. Richard could feel the audience's skepticism like a physical force as he walked onto the stage, Noah following a step behind, with the careful dignity of someone who understood the importance of the moment. 5,000 people filled the massive auditorium. Venture capitalists, software developers, technology journalists, and industry executives who had come expecting either a product launch or a public meltdown. What they saw instead was a man who looked smaller than his reputation suggested, walking hand in hand with a child who radiated the kind of uncomplicated joy that had no place in corporate America. Richard approached the podium and adjusted the microphone with hands that shook only slightly. He looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see whether he would emerge from this moment as a leader or a cautionary tale. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "My son Noah gave me a gift and I threw it in the trash." The silence that followed was absolute. No shuffling papers, no whispered conversations, no electronic devices beeping for attention. 5,000 people held their collective breath as Richard continued. "I didn't do it because I'm a monster, though I understand why many of you might think so. I did it because I'm a coward. For 4 years I've been so afraid of losing the people I love that I've pushed them away instead. I convinced myself that distance was protection, that if I didn't get too close to my son, it wouldn't hurt as much if something happened to him." He paused, looking down at Noah, who was standing beside the podium with an expression of quiet pride that gave Richard the strength to continue. "What I didn't realize is that my fear was hurting him more than any loss ever could. While I was building walls to protect myself from grief, I was teaching my son that his love wasn't valuable enough to keep." A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard could see people leaning forward in their seats, phones emerging to record what was either going to be a moment of genuine redemption or spectacular self-destruction. "I want to show you something," Richard said, pressing a button that brought up the image on the massive screen behind him. It was Noah's gift, the photograph of their day at Griffith Park, surrounded by the cardboard frame with its crayon decorations and careful handwriting. "This is what I threw away," Richard said, his voice growing stronger as he fully committed to the truth. "A memory of the last time I was a good father, the last time I let myself love my son without reservation or condition." The audience studied the image in fascination. The contrast was stark. The laughing, relaxed man in jeans and a t-shirt bore little resemblance to the polished CEO they had known for decades. But more than that, the pure joy on both faces in the photograph was impossible to fake or dismiss. "The words at the bottom," Richard continued, "say you still hugged me when I made mistakes with the code. My son remembers a moment when I was patient with his limitations instead of frustrated by them. He remembers when I loved him enough to put aside my expectations and simply enjoy his company." He turned to look at Noah, who was watching the screen with obvious delight at seeing their private memory shared with the world. "I built my fortune helping people connect with each other through technology," Richard said, turning back to the audience. "I revolutionized social media, created platforms that allow strangers to share their deepest thoughts, designed algorithms that can predict what people need before they know they need it. But I couldn't figure out how to connect with my own child." The confession hung in the air like a challenge. Richard could see the audience processing his words, weighing his sincerity against their preconceptions about corporate executives and absent fathers. "Some of you are wondering why I brought Noah here today," Richard continued. "Whether this is some kind of publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate my image. The answer is simple. I brought him because for 4 years I've been ashamed of the wrong things." He gestured toward Noah, who stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had been promised that his presence was welcome. "I was ashamed that my son learns differently than other children. I was ashamed that he doesn't fit the image of success that I spent decades crafting. I was ashamed that loving him required patience and acceptance rather than ambition and control." Richard's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he found his rhythm. "But standing here with him now, I realize that my shame was misplaced. I shouldn't be ashamed of having a son who sees the world differently. I should be ashamed of having spent so long refusing to see the world through his eyes." He reached out and took Noah's hand, feeling his son's fingers interlock with his own, in a gesture so natural that it made Richard wonder how he had ever found it difficult. "Noah, would you like to tell everyone what we've been working on this week?" Noah stepped closer to the microphone, his nervousness visible but not paralyzing. "We built a robot," he said, his voice small but clear. "It doesn't work perfectly yet, but Daddy says that's okay. He says that's what makes it beautiful." The simplicity of the statement hit the audience like a revelation. Here was a child who had learned to find beauty in imperfection, value in the process rather than just the outcome. It was a philosophy that most of the driven, success-obsessed people in the auditorium had never considered. "I want to tell you what Noah taught me this week," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded boardrooms for decades, but softer now, more human. "He taught me that intelligence isn't just about processing information quickly, it's about approaching problems with patience and curiosity. He taught me that success isn't just about achieving goals, it's about enjoying the journey with people you love." He paused, looking out at the audience with eyes that no longer held the calculating distance of his corporate persona. "Most importantly, he taught me that love isn't something you earn through achievement. It's something you give freely. Even when it's not returned, even when it's thrown away, even when the person you love is too afraid or too broken to accept it gracefully." The silence in the auditorium had shifted from skeptical attention to something deeper, the kind of profound quiet that settles over a crowd when they realize they're witnessing something genuinely important. "I stand before you today not as the CEO of Nexus Technologies, but as Noah's father," Richard continued. "A father who is still learning how to love his son the way he deserves to be loved, not despite his differences, but because of the unique perspective those differences give him on the world." He looked down at Noah, who was beaming with the kind of pride that only children can feel when their parents finally see them clearly. "To everyone who shared that story online, everyone who was outraged on my son's behalf, everyone who demanded better from me as a father, thank you. You were right. Noah deserved better. He deserved a father who treasured his gifts instead of discarding them, who celebrated his achievements instead of focusing on his limitations, who loved him loudly and proudly instead of quietly and conditionally." The applause began slowly, with a few scattered claps from the back of the auditorium. but it built steadily as Richard's words sank in, growing into something thunderous and sustained. This wasn't the polite approval of corporate audiences or the manufactured enthusiasm of product launches. This was the kind of emotional response that comes when people recognize genuine transformation taking place in front of them. In conclusion, Richard said, waiting for the applause to quiet, I want to make a promise, not to my shareholders or my employees, but to my son, Noah. I promise that I will never again throw away your gifts. I will treasure every drawing, every card, every moment you want to share with me. I promise to be the father you remembered in that photograph, the one who hugged you when you made mistakes, who found joy in your company, who saw your differences as gifts rather than problems to be solved. He knelt down beside Noah, speaking directly to him despite the thousands of people watching. And I promise to love you the way you've always loved me, completely, unconditionally, and without shame. The embrace that followed was captured by dozens of cameras, broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, and shared across every major news platform within hours. But for Richard and Noah, in that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only a father finally learning to be vulnerable with his son, and a child whose patient love had never wavered despite years of rejection. When they stood up, still holding hands, the standing ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes. The audience wasn't just applauding a speech, they were witnessing the public transformation of a man who had found the courage to choose love over fear, connection over protection, vulnerability over invulnerability. As they walked off the stage together, Noah looked up at his father with the bright smile that had been waiting 4 years to be fully appreciated. Did I do good, Daddy? You did perfectly, Richard replied, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. You always do. 1 month later, the changes in Richard Hale's life weren't immediately visible from the outside. He still lived in the same Beverly Hills mansion, still drove to the same gleaming tower in Century City, still wore the same expensive suits that had become his professional uniform. But anyone who looked closely would notice subtle differences. The way he smiled when his phone buzzed with a text from Noah during meetings, the framed photo of their robot building session that now sat prominently on his desk, the fact that he left the office every day at 5:30 sharp instead of working until midnight. The most significant change, however, was happening on Tuesday evenings in the community center in Westwood, where Richard had begun volunteering as a coding instructor for children with developmental disabilities. It had been Noah's idea, presented with the straightforward logic that characterized all his best suggestions. You're really good at computers, Daddy, and lots of kids like me want to learn. Maybe you could teach them. The program had started small with just 6 students and Richard's rusty attempts at patience-based pedagogy, but word had spread quickly through the special needs community in Los Angeles, and now 23 children gathered each week to learn basic programming concepts from one of Silicon Valley's most famous figures. Remember, there's no wrong way to solve this problem, Richard told 8-year-old Emma as she struggled with a simple animation sequence. The computer doesn't care if your code is pretty, only if it works. Emma beamed at him with the kind of pure joy that never failed to surprise him. These children approached challenges with a combination of determination and delight that most adults had forgotten how to access. They celebrated small victories with genuine enthusiasm, supported each other through difficulties without judgment, and found creative solutions that Richard's more conventional students would never have considered. Mr. Hale, called Marcus, a 10-year-old with autism who had shown remarkable aptitude for logical sequences, I made my robot dance, but it looks funny. Is that okay? Richard walked over to examine Marcus's work, a stick figure that jerked and spun in movements that were technically correct, but aesthetically chaotic. 6 months earlier, he would have felt compelled to optimize the code, to smooth out the irregularities and make the animation conform to professional standards. Instead, he laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly common in his interactions with the children. It's not funny, he said. It's perfect. Dancing isn't supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be joyful. This philosophy, the radical acceptance of imperfection as a form of beauty, had begun to influence every aspect of Richard's life. At Nexus Technologies, he had started encouraging his development teams to prototype with more creativity and less concern for immediate optimization. The results had been surprisingly positive, leading to breakthrough innovations that emerged from exactly the kind of unconventional thinking he had spent years trying to eliminate. The irony wasn't lost on him that the business world had begun to celebrate his new management style as disruptive leadership, when in reality, he was simply applying lessons learned from 12-year-olds who approached problems without the limiting beliefs that experience often imposes. "Daddy, are you ready to go?" Noah appeared at Richard's elbow, wearing his volunteer t-shirt and carrying a backpack full of the electronic components they had been using for the advanced students. He had become Richard's unofficial teaching assistant, possessing an intuitive understanding of how to explain complex concepts in simple terms. "Just finishing up," Richard said, saving Marcus's dancing robot to the shared drive where all the students could access each other's work. "Did you show Emma how to make her character change colors?" "She figured it out by herself," Noah said proudly. "She's really smart. She just thinks differently than other people." The casual wisdom in Noah's observation struck Richard as it so often did these days. His son had always possessed this ability to see people clearly, to recognize intelligence in forms that didn't conform to traditional metrics. It was a gift that Richard was finally learning to appreciate rather than dismiss. The drive home took them through neighborhoods that Richard had lived near for decades, but never really noticed. Tree-lined streets where children played in front yards, strip malls anchored by family restaurants and small businesses, the authentic Los Angeles that existed beyond the glossy surfaces of Beverly Hills and Century City. "Can we stop at Mario's?" Noah asked as they passed their favorite pizza place, a family-owned restaurant where the servers knew Noah by name and always brought him extra Parmesan cheese without being asked. "It's a school night," Richard said automatically, then caught himself. When had he become the kind of father who said yes to pizza on Tuesday evenings? When had routine become less important than spontaneous joy? "You're right," he said, turning into the parking lot. "Let's celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Marcus's dancing robot, Emma's color-changing character, the fact that 23 kids are learning to love computers the way we do. Mario's Pizza was exactly the kind of place that Richard had spent years avoiding, slightly too loud, casually decorated, filled with families who seemed more interested in enjoying each other's company than maintaining sophisticated conversation. Now it felt like a sanctuary, a place where he and Noah could simply be father and son without the weight of public scrutiny or professional expectations. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Noah," Tony, the owner's teenage son, greeted them with the enthusiasm reserved for regular customers. The usual had become large pepperoni with extra cheese for sharing, root beer floats, and a table by the window where they could watch people walk by on the street outside. It was such a normal, unremarkable tradition that Richard sometimes marveled at how long it had taken him to discover the pleasure of ordinary moments. "Daddy," Noah said as they settled into their booth, "do you miss being famous?" The question caught Richard off guard. The viral speech at the technology conference had indeed changed his public profile, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of destroying his reputation, his moment of vulnerability had somehow enhanced it. Business publications wrote about his revolutionary approach to leadership through authenticity. Parenting websites praised his journey toward conscious fatherhood. He had received speaking requests from around the world, book deal offers, and invitations to serve on numerous boards dedicated to disability advocacy. "I don't think I was ever really famous," Richard said carefully. "I was just successful in a way that people noticed." "But people know who you are now, like really know who you are." The distinction was more profound than Noah probably realized. For decades, Richard's public persona had been carefully curated, a collection of achievements and sound bites designed to project competence and confidence. Now, millions of people had seen him at his most vulnerable, had watched him acknowledge his failures as a father and commit to doing better. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, but Richard had learned to be suspicious of public approval. What mattered wasn't how strangers perceived his transformation, but whether the changes in his relationship with Noah were genuine and lasting. "I think," Richard said slowly, "I'm more interested in being known by the people who matter most. Like you. You want to know a secret?" Noah leaned forward conspiratorially. "I always knew who you really were, even when you were being grumpy and throwing away presents." "What do you mean?" "You're the daddy who taught me to ride my bike, the one who read me stories about dragons, the one who cried when Mom died because you loved her so much." Noah's voice carried the matter-of-fact wisdom that often left Richard speechless. "You just forgot for a while, but I remembered." The words hit Richard with unexpected force. While he had been constructing elaborate defenses against emotional vulnerability, Noah had simply been waiting for his father to remember who he used to be. The child's faith in his essential goodness had never wavered, even during the years when Richard himself had lost sight of it entirely. "How did you know I would remember?" Richard asked. "Because of the picture," Noah said simply. "The one in my present. You looked so happy holding me. People don't forget how to be happy. They just get scared sometimes." The insight was so pure and accurate that Richard felt tears threatening, another development that would have horrified him 6 months earlier, but now seemed like a natural response to moments of genuine connection. "I love you, Noah," he said, reaching across the table to take his son's hand. "More than I've ever been able to tell you." "I know," Noah replied, with the serene confidence of someone who had never doubted that fundamental truth. "I love you too. Even when you're scared, even when you make mistakes, even when you forget to be happy." Their pizza arrived, interrupting the moment, but not dispelling its warmth. As they ate and talked about Noah's upcoming science fair project, a more advanced version of their robot that could respond to voice commands, Richard realized that this was what he had been searching for all along, the simple pleasure of his son's company, unfiltered by agenda or expectation. The evening ended as it always did now, with Noah's bedtime routine that had evolved into something Richard looked forward to rather than delegated. They brushed teeth together in the master bathroom. Noah still needed help with technique, but Richard had learned that the assistance was an opportunity for connection rather than a chore to be completed efficiently. "Daddy," Noah said as Richard tucked him into bed, "will you stay for story time?" "Of course." Richard had recently started reading Noah the Harry Potter series, partly because his son enjoyed the magical elements, but mostly because the book's themes of love conquering fear resonated with their own journey together. Tonight, they were halfway through The Prisoner of Azkaban, at the point where Harry learns that his father's memory lives on in the hearts of people who loved him. "Is that how Mum works too?" Noah asked after Richard finished the chapter. "She's gone, but she's still here because we love her?" "Yes," Richard said, struck by how naturally Noah had grasped a concept that had taken Richard years to accept. "She's in your laugh. She's in your kindness. She's in the way you see the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." "She's in you too," Noah said sleepily. "When you hug me goodnight, when you help me with my homework, when you're patient with Emma and Marcus at computer class." "How do you know that?" "Because that's how she was with me. And now you are too." As Noah drifted off to sleep, Richard sat beside his bed for a few extra minutes, watching his son's peaceful expression and marveling at the child's capacity to see continuity where others saw only loss. Sarah was indeed present in their daily life, not as a haunting memory, but as a living influence that had shaped Noah's generous heart and was now reshaping Richard's understanding of what it meant to love without reservation. Later, alone in his home office, Richard opened his laptop and began working on the speech he had been invited to give at the National Down Syndrome Society's annual gala. The organization had asked him to talk about his journey as a special needs parent, but Richard had realized that the framing was backwards. He wasn't a parent who happened to have a child with special needs. He was a man who had been given the extraordinary gift of learning about love from someone who understood it instinctively. The speech began to take shape around that central insight, that Noah hadn't been changed by Richard's influence, but rather Richard had been transformed by Noah's example. The child who had been treated as a burden had become a teacher. The son who had been seen as imperfect had revealed the beauty in imperfection itself. As Richard wrote, he found himself thinking about the photograph that had started everything, the image of two people who loved each other simply and completely, without conditions or complications. That version of himself had never really disappeared. He had simply been buried under years of grief and fear and misguided ambition. The gift that Noah had wrapped so carefully wasn't just a memory of happier times. It was a reminder of who Richard could choose to be in every moment going forward. The father who hugged his son when he made mistakes with code, who found joy in imperfect achievements, who understood that the greatest success wasn't building a billion-dollar company, but raising a child who knew he was loved. Outside his window, Los Angeles sparkled with its usual mixture of dreams and ambition, a city built on the promise that anyone could reinvent themselves if they had enough courage and vision. Richard Hale had spent decades pursuing one version of that promise, accumulating wealth and status and recognition in the belief that external achievements could fill internal emptiness. Now he understood that the most radical reinvention was also the simplest, learning to receive love as generously as it was given, embracing imperfection as a form of grace, and accepting that his son's greatest gift hadn't been thrown away after all. It had been waiting patiently for him to unwrap it with open hands and an open heart. In the end, that was exactly what love had always asked of him. Not perfection, but presence. Not answers, but acceptance. Not distance, but the courage to draw close and stay close, even when closeness meant vulnerability, even when vulnerability meant the risk of loss. Richard saved his speech and closed the laptop, then walked upstairs to check on Noah one more time. His son was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around the stuffed dragon that had been his favorite companion since he was 3 years old. In the moonlight filtering through the bedroom window, Noah looked exactly like the child in the photograph. Innocent, trusting, filled with the kind of love that could survive any disappointment and forgive any failure. "Thank you," Richard whispered into the darkness, not entirely sure whether he was addressing his son, his late wife, or the universe that had given him a second chance to be the father Noah deserved. The only response was the gentle sound of his child's breathing and the quiet certainty that some gifts are too precious to ever throw away. They simply wait, with infinite patience, for the moment when we finally understand their value.